Hello, this is the Lord's Legion and welcome to a brand new countdown, and in this video we're going to be counting down the top 20 most interesting pieces of concept art from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And as the title suggests, this is of course the second volume. And so if you haven't seen the first volume, then you can check it out in the description down below, or at the very least it will be linked in this very video. And since we are very close into the release of Avengers Endgame, I thought now was the perfect time into doing a second volume, especially since the first volume came out over a year ago. And like with every list, I will of course add a poll so that you can choose on what series I should focus on next. But without further ado, let's begin with the countdown. Now kicking off the list at number 20, we have the humanoid Iron Jet from Iron Man 3. Now why I think this is a rather interesting design is because we haven't seen anything quite like it in the MCU thus far. In the sense that we do have an Iron Man armour that does possess wings that do resemble a jet, with a pair of rocket boosters to boot along with that. And plus the helmet itself sort of reminds me of the Ultimate Iron Man armour in a sense. Although the helmet itself does possess its own beak, and also the armour itself has a completely different colour palette. And it is a shame that we've never seen this armour materialise for Iron Man 3, because I think this one looks relatively kick-ass. So for number 19, we have Rogue Romanoff from Avengers Infinity War. Now for an Avenger who is supposedly on the run, you would expect Black Widow to have somewhat of a grittier costume, and this is why I personally think this one is much better in comparison to the final design. And while it made sense for Black Widow to dye her hair blonde just so that she can keep her identity a mystery, I do like the additional scarf that does come along with this outfit, as well as the hood that you can just easily pull over, which comes along with the scarf. Plus this design for Black Widow does suggest that she has become much more hardened, and that she's ever more determined into finishing the mission. Coming in at number 18, we have Cold War Winter Soldier from Captain America the Winter Soldier. Now this one is a much different design for the Winter Soldier, given how this does follow more towards the winter aesthetic. Most notably the fact that he does have a winter trench coat. And while this isn't exactly a practical look for the Winter Soldier during combat, you can't deny that this is a very badass design. Granted, I much prefer the final design over this one, but even still I do think this is a very interesting design for the Winter Soldier. Mainly because of how different and unique this is. And for number 17, we have the original Mantis from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Speaking of drastically different designs, I think this design for Mantis is relatively unique, and I would have much preferred this over the final product. And clear as day, this design for Mantis is a much better representation of the Mantis from the comics. But at the same time, it does have its own modern flair to the point where it does blend in well with the MCU. Although to a degree, I can see why they went with the final design over this one, mainly because it is very detailed. And so it would be much easier if they went for a simpler design, thus making the final look for Mantis being a lot easier to translate onto the big screen than this design. Even with that being said, I still think this is a very cool look for Mantis, and I wish they went with this over the final look. And for number 16, we have the weaponized ants from Ant-Man. Now this to me is a rather interesting aspect that was ultimately scrapped from the final film, because not only did the ants were originally intended into having some form of armour, but they were also going to have some form of weapons as well. Most notably the little turret on top of their backs, in which I assume are supposed to be little lasers that are non-lethal. And while this is a relatively cool design for the weaponized ants, and that it would be really cool to see on screen, at the same time I think it would be a little strange even for Hank Pym standards into weaponizing certain ants. And so in the long run I can understand on as to why this was ultimately scrapped. Because while Ant-Man in nature is a relatively wacky character, even this is pushing it. Coming in at number 15, we have an icy looking Gauntlet from Avengers Infinity War. Now this might just be the aura around the Infinity Gauntlet itself, but it did seem like it was going to have a completely different design altogether. Because if you look very closely, you can see that the Gauntlet itself was originally going to be silver instead of the traditional gold that we all know. And like I said, the blue aura around the gauntlet itself just kinda gives it that chilling presence. And even the Infinity Stones themselves seem to be lacking in the colour department, as they all sport the exact same white lighting. And as much as I think the aura around the gauntlet looks amazing, I am actually grateful that we did have the final design for the gauntlet instead of this one. Because to me, this version of the Infinity Gauntlet looks almost unrecognisable, and to me it just looks more like a knockoff than anything else. Or at the very least some variation of a prototype. So for number 14, we have Ultimate Scarlet Witch from Avengers Age of Ultron. Now most people who work in the costume department do claim that it is nigh impossible for them to implement her tiara for the MCU. But in my eyes, this concept art right here does kinda debunk that argument, as it does showcase that while yes, you can have the tiara be very faithful to the comics, but at the same time you can modernize it to a degree that it does make sense for the MCU. And while I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the Ultimate Wonder costume, I do think this outfit does have the most personality in comparison to the previous costumes that she has worn throughout the MCU thus far. And I especially appreciate the black that does blend in with the dark red, as it does help it stand out all the more. So for number 13, we have Eternal Thor from Thor Ragnarok. Now at first glance this does seem like one of those oddball costumes that they were trying to play around with, and you would be completely right, but to me this costume is very fascinating for two specific reasons. Firstly, this was intended to be Thor's gladiator costume, and as we know, in Sakaar is heavily influenced by some of Jack Kirby's work. However, this costume for Thor specifically does share a lot of resemblance to a specific Eternal who goes by the name Mercury, who is mainly known as the Eternal Speedster. And like with certain costumes, while I am glad that we haven't seen this in the final product, I can't help but find this certain costume fascinating in the sense that it does resemble Mercury from the Eternals, especially since Marvel Studios is working hard into bringing the Eternals to life. Swinging to the 12th place, we have the traditional Daredevil costume from Daredevil. Now many people were heavily disappointed by the final Daredevil costume, mainly because it was more tactical as opposed to it being like a traditional superhero costume. However, had we have had things our way, we could have had something in a similar vein to this design, in which while it does have some armor platings, it also looks incredibly sleek, which to me totally could work in an MCU movie featuring Daredevil, but on the flip side, I don't think this costume could ever work in a Marvel Netflix series, because this costume for Daredevil is much more fantastical, while the Marvel Netflix series is much more dark and gritty, and again, would not translate very well in that setting. But needless to say, you can't deny that this is a very kick-ass costume for Daredevil. Coming in at number 11, we have the true Abomination from The Incredible Hulk. Now as you all know, The Incredible Hulk was released at the time when superhero movies were supposed to be more realistic and were still very shy into touching upon the more fantastical aspects. Which is a huge shame because this design for the Abomination is so much superior in comparison to the final design. Because he is twice as tall as the Hulk, he looks incredibly menacing, and most importantly he looks more accurate to the comics, being incredibly green as well as sporting the iconic ears. And even when you look at this design closely, you can see some of the elements that were ultimately implemented to the final design for the Abomination. Most notably his bony chest as well as some spikes coming out of his body, which in my mind would have been the perfect design for the Abomination. Jumping into the top 10, we have the comic-inspired Iron Spider from Spider-Man Homecoming. Now many people were hoping in that we would have a comic-accurate Iron Spider costume, and at one point we were pretty close into seeing that in the final film. And while yes, you can see some elements of the Homecoming costume in this piece of concept art, you can see just enough of the Iron Spider, mainly with the spider logo on his chest, as well as the red and gold colour palette that this costume is most famous for. But unfortunately they had to tweak around the Iron Spider costume, mainly because this one wouldn't translate well if they were to use the comic version of the Iron Spider costume. Which to me it is a huge shame to say this, because the Iron Spider costume from the comics is one of my all-time favourite Spider-Man costumes. And while the Iron Spider outfit that we ultimately got in the MCU is pretty cool, part of me does wish that we could have had this one instead of what we ended up getting. Moving on to number 9, we have Old Man Rocket from Guardians of the Galaxy. Now this design for Rocket Raccoon did originate back when Guardians of the Galaxy was going to be this more gritty sci-fi flick. And when you look at this piece of concept art, you can tell that this is from that earlier version for the movie. Because as you can see, this version of Rocket is very worn, torn, and relatively old as well. And while Rocket has always been somewhat of a weapons master, they were going to go in a completely different direction by having him being this more seasoned and hardened warrior. But ultimately, I am grateful for the final design of Rocket because I honestly don't think this would have been a good representation of the character if they were to go in that direction. So for number 8, we have Haunted Ghost from Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now there's no denying that the costume that Ghost wore in Ant-Man and the Wasp was very comic accurate. That is both an amalgamation of the classic Ghost design as well as the more modern look for the character. But at one point it did seem like they were going to lean more towards the latter as they went full on modern with her costume. In the sense that the character was incredibly slender, almost to the point that she looked completely undead, and which would have given this villain more of this scary presence. But the most interesting aspect of the costume in my eyes is of course her claws, in which in the comics were mainly used to manipulate technology around her. But I think the main reason on as to why they scrapped this design for Ghost completely was because it would have been too scary for the younger demographic. Which to me it's a little unfortunate, mainly because I would have loved to have seen this on the big screen. Making its way to number 7, we have the Pre-Maestro Hulk from Thor Ragnarok. Now why I kinda deemed this design for the Hulk as Pre-Maestro is because we know from Thor Ragnarok that he's pretty much at his prime. But what seals the deal for me is the fact that the Hulk clearly has long hair and even a beard. And while his hair isn't exactly white or grey, it does resemble very much like Maestro minus the bald patch, which in a way could suggest that he is evolving into Maestro. And because we do know that Hulk has a 3-movie arc, I can imagine them trying to do something with Maestro in the end of Endgame, or maybe even something down the line for the future of the MCU. Landing its way to number 6, we have 90s looking Iron Man from Iron Man 1. Now clear as day, this is a very early design for the Iron Man armor for the movie, and it did seem like the main inspiration that they were going to go with was of course the more 90s armor, in which was bulkier, bright on colours, and even had similar arms and legs. And you can even see some wires around the armor that do once again resemble the 90s armor. And to be honest, I'm glad that they didn't go with this design because for one, I was never fond of the 90s armor to begin with, but more importantly, I don't think that would have ever translated well onto the big screen, especially given the limitations of Marvel Studios back then. Coming in at number 5, we have Ultimate Hawkeye from Captain America Civil War. Now it's no secret that Hawkeye has always had it rough in terms of costumes in the MCU, however it was Captain America Civil War that came closest into doing his costume justice, as they finally decided to give him some purple. But even still, that costume could have been so much better if they were to give him this ultimate mask. Sure, it's not like the 616 Hawkeye costume, which is something that I would want to see more than anything else, but in my mind, Ultimate Hawkeye is still a good alternative. But at the same time, I can kinda see why they didn't go with this design, mainly because it does have some resemblance to the Winter Soldier, and it could have potentially led to some confusion there. But even with all that being said, I still think they dropped the ball by not using this design for Hawkeye. Coming in at number 4, we have the Death Zealots for Doctor Strange. Now at first glance, many people assumed that this was in fact Mistress Death, in which is pretty understandable considering the resemblance, but as it turns out, it was in fact the original design for Caecilius's henchman, in which I will say looks infinitely much better than what we ended up getting considering how they have more personality and they looked more mystical. But I suppose the main reason on as to why they removed the designs completely was because they looked a little too inhuman. But in my mind, I do personally believe that this design that they had going for them was much more menacing. So coming in at number 3, we have the Soul Skull from Avengers Infinity War. Now it was a pleasant surprise to see the return of the Red Skull as he appeared as the Stonekeeper. But despite how he only really had one scene to his name, he had a bunch of alternate designs. And while most of them looked horrific to say the least, my personal favourite is this one right here, where he is clearly one with the Soul Stone it seems. and this version of the Stonekeeper makes him almost seem as if he is a ghostly figure. Almost as if he is the physical embodiment of the Soul Stone, despite how it isn't exactly the case in the final film. But even still, they did play off with that idea during the designs, and a lot of them in my eyes were very creative. Coming in at number 2, we have gigantic Ultron from Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, as far as I'm aware, this was intended to be the original final fight for the movie, but instead they decided to use Ultron and his armies for the final fight, which to me this is a huge shame because the original fight scene would have been so much more memorable, and having a gigantic Ultron would have made up for a fantastic action set piece. And in my eyes, having a gigantic Ultron would have stand out much better, mainly because this was something we have yet to see from the Avengers. Plus it makes sense given that Ultron always wants to improve himself through various means, and by doing so I would have thought that Ultron's final form should have been something in a similar vein to this, but instead they wanted to make it feel much more like the original Avengers, and in doing so it just felt more of the same. And finally, for number 1, we have the Caped Panther from Black Panther. Now, believe it or not, this was actually intended to be T'Chaka's costume, as he would have worn that costume during the opening flashback. But truth be told, I think this is such an amazing outfit because it just perfectly represents Black Panther from the comics. It perfectly implements his cape and robe. You can also see plenty of gold throughout his costume, and there's even some elements of his more modern costume during the Shadowland event. And if you ask me, I would love to see this costume actually be made and have T'Challa wear it for the sequel, because it's just an amazing design and it just perfectly represents Black Panther as a whole. So which piece of concept art did you personally find the most interesting out of all of them from the MCU? Comment below and share some thoughts, and don't forget to go on the poll and vote on the next series that I should focus on. And as always, thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe, take care and have a good one.